Hi everybody, this is Jason Williams. I was recently able to attend as an observer a programming competition for high school and college students. One of the problems seemed to give some people a couple of issues. The judges said that one of the things they noticed was that testing and regression testing in particular was one of the things that kind of tripped people up. And so there were some things that they were able to throw at programs that made it so that they didn't work or they crashed or they malfunctioned, that sort of thing. So I just wanted to maybe make a little video here to talk about a similar problem. I obviously don't have access to the actual problem, but from what I gather, this was similar to that problem. And take a look at maybe how we could approach it so that we can test things fully and make sure that they don't regress as we go through the solution and kind of put safety nets around our project. So let's take a look at the problem. The problem is that we have a CSV file and it gives us the layout of the file, and we're supposed to read that and we're supposed to display each of the rows to the users. In addition, if there's any errors on those rows, and those errors would be defined by not matching some of the criteria, for instance, if a status is outside of 1, 2, 3, or 4, or if the date's not a date, that sort of thing, we should show those errors along with a row number so the user knows which of the rows had the error. And that was it. Seems deceptively simple, I think. So let's take a look at maybe one of the ways that we could solve this problem. So let's start with a class. Very first thing I think of when I think of reading something from a file is to represent it in memory as some sort of type. And so let's call this class instead of class 1. Let's call this, and these are orders, so we'll call these order records. So this is an order record. And it's going to have order number, and then it's going to have a date, and then it's going to have the, let's see, what was the other thing? It's going to have the amount, and it's going to have a status, and it's going to be 1, 2, 3, or 4, so let's call that a byte. We don't need any more than that for now. Okay, and then we're going to need a way to read these things in, and so probably we're going to want some other class to do the reading, and so let's create a class called order file reader. And let's just say it has a method on it called, it's going to return a list of order records, and it's going to be called read, right? And then, okay. So we're about to jump into some logic. So we're in competition mode. We have 4 hours to complete this, is what the time limit was in the competition. And so how would we go about doing this quickly and still have a correct solution? Well, I like to jump to unit testing because that seems to be a fairly straightforward way to make sure we don't regress. And so let's start an XUnit project, and we'll call it order file reader tests. And then this is going to be testing the order file reader. And so the very first test that we probably want to make is that when we pass CSV into it, we get a record back, right? So that would be kind of the bare minimum. So let's say read returns a record when valid CSV is passed. Okay, and so that might look like records equals, well, let's make our system under test first. So XUnit allows us to use the constructor as test setup. So we'll go and we'll say order file reader system under test. And we're going to need a reference to the other project. And then in the constructor we'll say like that. Okay, And then we're going to say the system under test. There's the read method that we were talking about. And then we can assert that we've got a single record when we pass in a CSV. So let's go grab some sample CSV that the judges gave us, right? So let's grab this first record. And we'll call this a const string. We'll call it one valid record. And Visual Studio paste that in nicely for us. And we'll pass in that one valid record, and we would expect a single record to come back, right? Okay, so we've got our first test set up. Let's run it. All right, and then it failed, right? We're returning null instead, so that certainly should be fixed. And so we're going to go fix this test. So bare minimum, we're going to need to return, and let's say results equals new, and results.add, right? And then return results. Okay, and then let's get our test running. And if you're not familiar with test-driven development, which I'm kind of skirting around here, we're just doing the bare minimum to make our tests pass because we're building the tests as we go, and the tests will get more and more complex as we get further and further down the requirements list. Next, we want to say, okay, it's going to return 4 records when valid CSV is passed, right? So let's go grab an example of 4 records. So we've got the header, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's all of these. So we'll copy this in. We're going to say 4 valid records. And that's going to paste in nicely for us, thanks to Visual Studio. And then we're going to have a similar test here. And we're going to change this to true count is 4. Let's do something else. Let's say equal. And we expect 4 for the record count. Okay, so let's run that. Obviously, we would expect this to fail, and it does. And so now we start to think a little harder about what exactly we're doing here. So we've got the CSV passed in, and that's going to be lines that we need to split up. So that's probably the first thing that we were going to want to do, is we're going to want to say, let's go ahead and get our lines and CSV split. And this hint isn't quite right in my opinion. I think we need to say new line here. Not sure exactly what platform the judges are going to be running this on, so we want to make sure we obey the platform's carriage return rules there. And then now that we have the lines, we can do something like this, where we say, instead of just new list here, we could say lines and then select new order record, like that. And that's going to get us a record for every line in the file, or in the CSV contents that gets passed to us, right? And we need this to be a list, so instead of an IEnumerable, that's why it's complaining, okay? And this isn't going to be quite right because it's going to include a header. So our file includes a header, and we're expected to just return the records, not the header. And so the way we're going to handle that is we're going to skip that first line, right? So we'll skip 1. And now we should have 4 lines returned, and our test should pass. So let's go ahead and prove that. Got 1. You know why? Because I'm passing in the wrong test data. All right. Now we should be on track here. Okay, there we go. All right, and then obviously for 1, we would expect 1. So let's go ahead and let's run both tests just to be sure. So yes, they both pass. Cool. Okay, so now obviously they're just new records. They don't have any data in them. We haven't pulled any data out of the text content into our actual record. So let's write a test to do that. So read returns, let's say, the correct data in the correct properties when valid CSV is passed. I'm not thinking too hard about my test names here. That's not a great test name in my opinion, but it'll do for now. Records, CT read, and then let's just do one valid record to make it easy to test. And then we can say first equals records, and then we can assert equal that, so this one record here, our order number is this. So we should say, be able to say, our order number should be that. And 2024, 6/15. Oh, yes, that's correct. And then date there. Okay. And then our amount should be, and make sure that's a decimal, and this will be first dot amount. And then lastly, our status is going to be, okay. And so that's what we would expect our record to parse out as, right? So let's run this test. It's going to be red, obviously. And so it's not going to pass that assertion, that first assertion. And so let's think about how we want to handle this. So I think probably we're going to want to start a new method, and we can make the method match what the select wants. So the select wants a method that takes a line, a text line, right? So we could make a method here that we could return an order record from and call it parse maybe, and call it record, and then we can change this to parse, right? And then we can return new order record. But this would be the exact same thing as we had before. But instead of doing that, we want to fill in some values. So let's do this. Let's say we need to split this by commas, right? So columns equals record split, and we're going to split by the comma character. And then we're going to say order number is column 0. Our date is date only, parse column 1. And then our amount is decimal, parse column 2. And then our status is going to be byte parse column 3, right? Because we're zero-based index. Okay, and so let's go take a look and see what that did for our test here. Run this, and sure enough, it passes. Great. All right, so we've got a working parser that has pretty much all of our happy paths covered, where we're getting perfect records in and we're parsing them out and we're returning them correctly. Now we have to start thinking about these sad paths, right? So what if our order number didn't match its validation requirements? So let's go look at those. So in the instructions, it says the order number can only be a maximum of 15 characters. So what if that order number was more than 15 characters? Well, we would need to show an error, right? And so because the requirement is that if the file doesn't match the validation rules, we want to display the row number along with the description of the problem for that row. Okay? What we need to do is write a test that would test for an order number that is too long. So let's try read a validation error order number is too long. Okay, and so we're going to save our records system under test, read, and then we need some new test data. So let's go grab, let's grab the same thing we have here. Order number too long record. Right? Then let's make our order number too long. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 right now, it looks like. And so we need 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, which is the limit, and then 16 is going to be our record is too long there. Okay. And so then we're going to pass in that order number too long record. And then we've got to design a little bit. Let's grab our first record here. We've got to design how are we going to return these errors. I mean, it kind of makes sense if we've got records coming out already. We probably want to return them on those records. Probably we're going to want to modify our order record a little bit so that it can handle these errors, right? So let's make a new class here because we need a list of errors. And, well, do we need a new class? Actually, we may not need a new class. Let's try it without a new class. We are going to need to record the row number. So let's say public int row number. And then let's go ahead and create a list of strings, and we'll call these validation errors. And let's initialize that just for simplicity. So now this record will record the row number and it will record the validation error. Probably we want to assert here that well, we need to test that row number first. Is the row number being returned correctly? So let's put this aside here real quick and make a new test. Returns correct row numbers when CSV. I like that suggestion. And so this would be really similar to this test here. And this is going to be one valid record that we're passing in, and so then we would expect that row number, let's see, in the file, let's go look at the file here. So in the file, this first record is on row number 2 because we have this header, right? So header is row number 1, this record is row number 2. So let's expect 2 here. And then this would be row number. So let's run this. And obviously that's not going to pass. Row number's not being filled in anywhere. So let's go take a look at how we would do the row number. And there is an overload for select that can also take the index of the record. And so instead of just the string version of the record, we can also ask it for the index of the record that we're working on. And it will fill that in for us. The trick about it is it's going to be the index of the collection the select is run on. So if you can imagine, we have this file here, and this is index number 0, and this is index number 1, and this is index number 2, and so on and so forth. However, this isn't actually index 0 in our case, because what are we doing? We're skipping one. So what's index 0? Index 0 is actually our first record. So instead of an off by 1 problem, we have an off by 2 problem. And so instead of just pasting the index into the record, or the row number, so row number, instead of just doing this, obviously that won't work because it's 0 based. And we can't just do this because we're skipping our row number. So we're off by 2, so we're going to have to add 2 here to get the correct number. And so if index is 0, our first row number is going to be 2. If index is 1, our next row number is going to be 3, which matches this file. See, we have 2 here, 3 here, 4 here, 5 here. So we want to start at 2. Okay. All right, hopefully that's clear. And hopefully my thinking is correct. So let's go ahead and run this. All right, that passes. So we get 2 back, which is great. And then we can go back to our other test here. If we have this one record where the order number is too long, then we would assume that we've got a single error, validation error, right? So there should be a single validation error here, and obviously we're not going to have any because we haven't done anything with validation errors yet. And so let's think a little bit about how we want to do validation. Probably we're going to want to validate this list of columns first. And we've kind of hard-coded these indexes, which maybe we should put into constants up top, but we can use those indexes to parse things out as well. So let's go ahead and return a list string validate, and this is going to be a single, this is going to be an array of strings, we'll call it columns. And then validate is going to check each of the individual columns for their validity. Let's make a new function called string validate order number. And this is going to be like this. And then we're going to say if order number length is greater than 15, then we're going to return order number it can only be 15, can only be up to 15 characters long. Okay. Otherwise, let's just return null. And then up here, we can say order number validation equals validate order number, and we're going to say columns 0, and if order number validation isn't null, I like that, okay, then we want to say, going to want to return this list here, results equals, okay, and then we can say results add order number validation, like that. And then how do we get this into our record? So obviously we're going to need a variable for that. We're going to want to say var record is that. We have our columns, so we're going to want to say, actually probably we're going to want to say record equals new order record, right? And probably we could fill in the row number no matter what, which is this here. I'm making a little bit of a mess here. I'll clean it up in a second. And then we're going to want to validate. And we're going to want to say record dot validation errors equals validate, and then pass in our columns. Right? And then we're going to want to go ahead and fill in the rest of the information. So this here, record dot here, and then correct some punctuation. This has got to be just super exciting to watch. Apologies. So this is called record here. So we'll call this result. There we go. Now it's happier. Okay, so we've got our validation errors, and then we've got the rest of the record being filled in. Okay, did a lot of reorganizing there, a little bit of refactoring, that sort of thing. So let's make sure that our tests still pass. We've got some build errors here. Let me check these out. Okay. All right. So we need to return results from here. And then this doesn't return anything either, so we need to return result here. Right. Okay. All right, so let's go and make sure that our tests still pass, and I'm just going to run all of them, including our new one here that we've been working on, just to be sure we haven't regressed. So it looks like they all pass, which is great. All right, so now we've got a validation error, and you know what? I usually don't do this, but I'm going to go ahead and let's do a contains order number. Let's make sure our validation error actually has something in it, and then first dot validation errors like that, right? Okay, still passes. All right. So now let's make a validation test for date. What's a way that we could test that? Well, let's make read take a record that turns a validation error when date is invalid. So what's an invalid date? Well, an invalid date might look something like this. Let's copy our good record. And then let's make a date record. Let's make the date, let's see, February 31st. That's not a real date. Okay. And so we should be able to pretty much copy this verbatim. Invalid date record. Let's not make that mistake again. Grab the first record, check to make sure we have a validation error, and then that validation error should say something about date, right? So let's test this. And we actually crash on date parse because it's an invalid date, and date only can't parse it. So that's a fail. And so we obviously want to add a validation to that. But that brings up another issue. We probably are not going to want to do the rest of this work if there are validation errors. Especially with these dates and these numbers, it's not gonna like us very much. So probably we want to put in if result.validation errors count is 0. Then we want to go ahead and fill the rest of this stuff in. Otherwise, there's a problem, so we probably are going to want to skip it. And we could maybe do a little bit more work and try and figure out which of the columns is incorrect, and return a more complex object back from this validate method that tells us which of the columns was incorrect. And maybe we'll expand that later. You know, we've got 4 hours in the competition. If we finish this up quick, maybe we can go back and get a little more exact and show the data that we can versus, you know, skip the data that we can't show because it's imparsable. So anyway, that should fix that error from our test. My guess is the test still should not run, right? Because we aren't returning an actual validation error for the date. So we want to go ahead and do that. And I'm not super thrilled, like I mentioned, about these indexes. Let's refactor a little bit. Let's go ahead and make these constants. So constant int order number index is 0, date index is 1, value index is 2, and then status index is 3, right? And then we can change these to be order number index, date index, and then amount index. Did I call it something different? I did. It needs to be amount index, and then status index. There we go. And then down here we're using it as well, so let's do order number index there. Just kind of clean it up a little bit, keep those magic strings from our magic numbers from coming back and biting us one day. All right, so let's write a validation method for the date. So we're going to want to validate date. And we're going to want to say if the date only triparse of date, if it can't parse it, so we'll negate that, then we're going to return date and then say date is not a valid date. Otherwise, we're going to return null, right? And then we kind of have this orchestration method up here that's kind of orchestrating the validation. So date validation equals validate date. I like that. If that's not null, then we're going to results add date validation, like that. That seems to be correct to me, because we're going to add that validation in here. We're going to check our count's going to be greater than 0, and so it won't do this, which is going to mean that our date parse won't bomb out. And I think that's good. So we're going to say run this test, and it passes. Great. And so I think that one's going to pretty much cover the date. Let's move on to the value. Fact, public void, read, returns validation error when amount is invalid. Okay, and let's make an invalid amount record. So let's go here. What would make this invalid? Well, an invalid number that couldn't be parsed might be blank, right? So a blank string would cause our amount to be invalid. So let's go down and use this. Invalid amount, and then we're going to check to see if amount is in the error message. So let's run this. And we're going to end up with a parsing error like we did with the date, because you can't turn a blank string into a number. It doesn't know how to do that. All right, so our test indeed fails. So let's add a validation for the amount. Validate amount. If not decimal, try parse amount. I like that. Return amount is not a valid number. Okay, otherwise we're going to return null. And then we need to make our validate method amount validation. Like that. I like that. If validation is not null, then we're going to return, or we're going to add that to the results. Now let's run our test, and it passes. Great. All right, and then, there was one other field, so let's go ahead and move on to that other field so we have methods that cover each of the fields, and then we'll expand them a little bit, because we do have some other validation that we need to do other than just can it parse. So read returns validation error when status is invalid. And this is going to be really, really similar. So let's call this invalid status record, and let's make that a blank, right? Because numbers can't be made from blanks. And let's copy this in here. And this should be invalid status record. And then we should be looking for the keyword status here. So let's run that. that we would expect to fail, which it does. Let's make a method that checks status. Validate status. And if we can't parse the status, then we're going to return status is not a valid number. Otherwise, return null. Okay, and then we're going to call that from our validate function. Like so. I like that. And I like that. Okay. All right, so now let's go run our test again. Actually, it'd probably be good. Oh, interesting. Okay, so status wasn't found. So let's go check the error message that we're showing. Validate status. Status. You at home probably see this and I don't. What's wrong? Status here. If we can't parse out, that seems right. Status validation is validate amount. Whoops. Validate status. Sometimes those Visual Studio hints are incorrect. Okay. All right, so now let's run all of our tests just to be sure we haven't regressed anywhere. Good. And all good. So we have all passing tests, which is great. All right, if you remember from the instructions, there were a couple of other validation things that we should check around the amount and the status. So the amount should be a positive number, right? So this should always be a positive number. And then the status should only ever be 1, 2, 3, or 4. And so it should be restricted to that subset of numbers. And so let's go add that to our validation. So here we're going to say read returns validation error when amount is not positive. Okay. And then this should be, let's make another test record here. Negative amount record. So let's say -1 there. Okay. And negative amount record gets passed in there. It should be complaining about amount as a validation error. Let's run that. And we don't have any validation errors because we haven't included that validation rule. So let's add that rule to the amount method. So here, now that we know that it's a valid number, we can say if result is less than or equal to 0, because we have to be a positive number, right? Return amount is not a positive number. Okay. And then let's go back to our test. Let's run that. And we've got a passing test. Similarly to that, we're going to need a new test here. Read returns validation error when status is out of range. Copy this. And then we're going to say, so we're going to say, let's make this 9, right? So that's going to be out of range. Whoop, name it correctly. Status out of range record. And then let's go use that record, status out of range record. It should be complaining about status. So let's run this test. And obviously the test is failing because we have no validation, because 9 is a valid number. It's just we haven't added that rule yet. So validate status, we change this to say if result is less than 1 or result is greater than, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. If it's greater than 4, so 1 to 4, return status is out of, let's say, is not a valid status. How about that? And so then let's run this. And our test passes. One last time, let's run the whole test suite. Make sure that all the tests pass, and indeed they do. So I think we have a lot of our validation rules covered, if not all of them. I think this is a fairly good demonstration of how we can use unit testing to potentially provide some regression testing so that while we're developing the application where it's actually displaying the information to the end user, we don't end up changing something we're not supposed to. We always have that test suite to back us up. If you have any questions or if you'd like to see any other videos like this, please leave a comment. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.